Thank you, everyone. We have an exciting panel next. We're very honored to have 4 of our legislators from 4 different parts of the state joining us today. We have Delegate David Bulova up from Northern Virginia, who knows everything there is to know about water, I think, in the legislature, and represents a very urban viewpoint for us as well in this discussion. And then we have Delegate Keith Hodges from the Middle Peninsula, who is, I don't want to say the king of septic, that doesn't sound good, but definitely a leader in septic and stormwater.
You should hear what my wife says.
Yes. And then we have Senator Monty Mason from the Peninsula, represents this area, and he serves on the Natural Resources Committee on the Senate, so on the side, so he brings an important perspective there. And then we have Delegate Christopher Stolley, who is the mastermind behind the Special Assistant to the Governor for Coastal Adaptation and Protection, as well as the Commonwealth Center for Recurrent Flooding Resiliency, which is a partnership between VIMS, Old Dominion University, and VCPC. So he has been at the forefront of these sea level rise issues for some time now. So I'm going to ask you all a few questions, and I'll start by asking a question to a particular legislator and then open it up to everyone else to respond as well, just so that everyone knows who's going to lead off the discussion. So since it's really all about money, I'm going to start with Delegate Bulova. Are there existing state funding programs for septic, sewer, roads, and NBFs? Oh, and I meant to start with a quiz about all of the acronyms in Carl Hirschner's presentation, but are there state funding programs for septic, sewer, or roads or NNBFs that you believe could be modified to increase funding for making infrastructure more resilient?
Great. Well, thank you. And that really kind of comes down to the basic question, doesn't it? And because I can, I'm going to go ahead and start off by saying good morning, everybody. Very good. Anyways, wonderful crowd, and thank you so much to the Coastal Policy Program for putting this on. And I want to apologize for 2 things. I feel like I'm a little bit of the odd man out. I looked at the elevation of my district, and it's a safe 312 feet above sea level, so I'm up there in the Piedmont. The other thing is that I apologize because we have heard some fantastic presentations, and the technical information, the policy information that we're hearing is first rate, and then you have to rely on people like the 4 of us up here to actually introduce and run that through the General Assembly to get things accomplished. So bear with us. We are interested in learning, but we want to thank you for all your hard work in this very, very important field. So it really does come down to a lot with funding. And so even if funding weren't an issue, this would be an enormously complicated engineering feat to deal with coastal resiliency. And so you add funding into the mix, and it makes it all that much more complicated. And what makes it more complicated is that it's not just that traditional debate over whether we find money from existing services or whether we increase revenue. There's a couple of very fundamental principles when you're talking about an issue that affects the Commonwealth of Virginia, but its impacts are felt in one particular area. And so you have to think about how strategically that funding is going to be applied. And so are we getting high value targets for whatever funding we're talking about? We talk about the cost effectiveness or cost efficiency of what we're doing. And so does the funding mechanism get us our best bang for the buck? Is it adequate and sustainable? I think one of the things that the General Assembly and a lot of governments do often is we throw a little bit of money in to say that we're doing something, but if it's only a small drop in the bucket, what's the point? We feel good about it, but we haven't really solved the problem. And then for all of our regions, is it equitable? Is there a rational relationship between who pays and who benefits? And so I think that we're seeing some of this play out in terms of the constitutional amendment that you all will be considering next Tuesday for Election Day. And so it is an amendment to our Constitution that authorizes our localities to be able to provide some kind of partial tax break on real property for those property owners who are willing to invest in resiliency. And you're seeing these exact debates play out in newspapers and in forums across Virginia. And so it's interesting because, I looked at the Fredericksburg paper up there, so the Freelance Star, and they had a particular point of view that, hey, this was not a good use of funding. This was a giveaway to coastal property owners. That it was basically a transfer of wealth from one place to another, and that it didn't really solve the overall problem of how do you get people out of the floodplains to begin with. On the other hand, you had the Hampton Roads paper, the Virginian Pilot in particular, that saw this as an extraordinarily pressing issue. And they made the case, hey, not only is this a good way to spend the taxpayers' dollars, but it's also a way to make sure that we're leveraging that tax money with private investment. And so I know each of the legislators up here probably has their own perspective on that, but if you want a glimpse into what the debate will look like in the General Assembly as we're trying to decide how we're going to fund these things, you're getting a glimpse of it right now with respect to that constitutional amendment. Notwithstanding, I wanted to really briefly just highlight on a couple of things with regard to existing and then potential funding sources for coastal resiliency. And so one of them is, how do you marshal our existing resources more effectively and efficiently? And so one of the things that was mentioned earlier on was something like the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund grant program. And so that is something that's meant to go towards water quality for cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay. But one thing that you could do is, with that $20 million that we have out there, if you've got two projects that are out there, you could score one over the other if one of them can have that co-benefit of some kind of resiliency aspect to it. Smart Scale was another example of how you can do that with transportation. And so again, if you've got transportation projects that are on equal footing with each other, how do you incorporate the idea of resiliency or the potential to go ahead and address resiliency in the way that those things are scored? I'll tell you though, as a Northern Virginian, that then gets back into the equity issue, because how do you compete with Northern Virginia versus Hampton Roads versus other parts of Virginia, each of us which have very, very different needs, and we're all competing for a limited pot of money. Another thing I wanted to touch on real quick is how to empower our local governments to be able to raise or generate the revenue that they need. And I think as a General Assembly, like so many things, we can be a real partner in all this, and we need to be, but a lot of the lion's share of all this is going to come down to our localities, and we need to recognize that, and we need to provide them the tools that they need to succeed. A lot of our Hampton Roads localities, and actually a lot of our localities throughout Virginia, have things called stormwater utility fees, and so that's something that could be part of the solution. Another example is that the Virginia Code allows localities to put in service districts. And so that's a way to be able to draw lines around, hey, where's your problem? Who's going to benefit? How much is that going to cost? And how do we go ahead and allow us to go ahead and raise the revenue in the area where we're going to see the biggest benefits? One of the things that I realized as I was trying to think through my thoughts here is that service district fees in Virginia are real property tax based, and so it's no different than if you're raising revenue from just a regular tax. And so something that us legislators might want to do is look at giving localities some more flexibility with how they structure a service district, again, so that you can have a rational nexus between how that revenue is generated and then who it benefits. And so that could be something that we could get out there and allow localities some additional flexibility. And the last one I wanted to talk about is it's great to repurpose existing funds, wonderful to empower our localities to do the things that we all need to do. But ultimately, I'm pretty convinced that we're going to need to have new funding if we are serious about resiliency in Virginia. And so in the remarks made at the beginning, it was mentioned the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And so the neat thing about joining RGGI, it's a cap and trade program for those of you who are not familiar. And so it ultimately gets at the causes of sea level rise. But by doing so, it generates a pretty decent sustainable amount of money that can go towards things like resiliency. And so if I recall correctly from last year's bill, the estimate is it would generate about $200 million annually that could go back into coastal resiliency and other measures to go ahead and protect our environment. And so that's something that I hope that we will consider again this next year, because again, if we are serious about getting at the problem, we need to make sure that that funding is adequate and sustainable in the long term.
Great. Does anyone else want to chime in on that question?
I'll make a quick comment, if
Okay.
I may. Can't be as eloquent as Delegate, Delegate Bulova. Looking back over the years, the number of programs just dealing with water quality and water resource management, you start to think about that list. It's very long when you look at the laws and regulations. And these laws and regulations, when they were passed and they were put into place, did not account for recurrent flooding. And these programs, when we look at these programs, folks are very resistant to change these programs. But I do believe we need to take a long and serious look at them, because I do believe we can build a better mousetrap and get a better bang for the buck with water quality and how we spend those dollars. So I think we all need to get together and really look at things differently and start to make changes in all of these programs for the better.
Okay. Well, Senator Mason, I'm going to ask you a question about NNBFs. And for everyone to remember, it's natural or nature-based features, that acronym stands for. Can you discuss the importance of NNBFs to address environmental issues in your region and the challenges in using them to address flooding that crosses jurisdictional boundaries?
Sure. Thank you. Well, good morning. Glad you told me what the acronym was before she asked me to answer the question. This is a phenomenal turnout. Note to self, start every conference with a wine breakfast and you get a lot of people to show up. This is really good. I'll start for a second on the constitutional amendment that David touched on a little bit. Yes, there's some good, legitimate debates out there, whether you're picking someone over another or, there's a hardscape question associated with that, whether you're incenting that. But there's also a bit of misinformation involved in what I've seen recently. And today, in the notes for VPAP's notes section across Virginia, someone with the title of a river keeper said that he or she did not think it was a good idea to use and to incent people to go into areas and build in low-lying areas. Well, this is for improved real estate only. All right, so that is not a part of the program. That's not what this constitutional amendment says. So it's super important that we get the facts right when we're having debates about important topics like that, because then, and they're also, it's allowing the localities to make some determinations as to how they implement as well if they do some sort of incentives. And remember, when we think about waterfront land or coastal or resilient recurring flooding areas, there are a lot of low-lying areas that are not the wealthy, high-end homes on the rivers. There are a lot of areas that are subject to constant flooding that we don't think of when you think of the $1-million home on the water. Right? So this could be really broadly applied, and that I'll try to connect that to the question about cross-jurisdictional. Natural barriers. I don't know if you've shown them the map that they show. There's one map that shows this area, and then you overlay it with what could the natural areas, the natural barriers be, and what could it protect. And I think that's a great approach, because the Admiral was talking about the business community be involved. What is the economic benefit to a natural barrier? Well, it may protect all of these properties if we continue to keep this as a natural barrier. So I think there are ancillary benefits that we have to sell to the business community, to other areas just beyond the work that we do here to show its importance. But then you have cross-jurisdictional problems. A great example in Hampton and Newport News is New Market Creek that comes in by the Hampton Coliseum. And so when you're going through by the Hampton Coliseum, you see all the low-lying areas and water there. Well, that winds all the way through. I had no idea until they showed me. Winds all the way through almost to Newport News. Well, over there in Newport News, there is an outflow that they built to the James. So they have water coming down, they've redirected it to go out in the James. Well, the spillway or whatever stops the water and redirected to the James, when we have big rains, heavy flooding, just spills right over. Well, now you have the tidal push into New Market Creek and the winds that drive the water in, and this water coming from Newport News, and there are apartment complexes in Hampton that flood every time. And so Hampton is having to look to making a decision, do we just go ahead and acquire this property because we're constantly having to help people that live in these apartment complexes, with just events that aren't even that enormous. And so there's a place that one jurisdiction built something to solve a problem, another jurisdiction suffers from a problem in a completely different area, but they come together, and we have to work together to figure out. John Miller, who unfortunately we lost and I succeeded in the Senate, brought a bill to one of our committees when I was in the House, and it said it required all localities to do an assessment of other localities' resiliency plans. And it got all spun up in the committee that assessment sounded like a tax. And so he had to remove the word assessment on the committee just to move his bill forward to try to make sure each localities talk about each other. So that's a ridiculous example, but it's kind of to Keith's point that these programs that we've had in place for a while, you have to constantly update and build and make them work for the modern generation and the problems we're trying to solve today.
Delegate Stolle?
I just want to speak to the constitutional amendment real quick. The constitutional amendment is the first step. It's not the legislation or the regulation that follows behind. So before you can do legislation, before you can do regulation, you have to have permission in the Constitution to do it. Right. So this doesn't say you can do something or that you can't do something locally or with any specific property. This allows legislation to move forward, and then on that legislation, regulation of how that will be done. These are the things that we have to consider as we move forward. We have to open our horizons and not just think of all the threats out there, but what are the opportunities? And when you have barriers like what we currently have in the Constitution, if we don't start making some movement on this, we're not going to be able to solve this bigger problem.
Anyone else? All right, Delegate Hodges, septic. Considering that septic failure or the lack of sewer or septic systems, what VDH calls wastewater island, poses a significant public health risk and deteriorates water quality. What are the arguments for and against the expansion of the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act septic pump-out requirement to the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed or even to the entire state?
Well, first, good morning, and thank you all for coming out. Wonderful conference, and thank you, Elizabeth. It's always a pleasure to work with you on these issues and to be here with you. In looking at expanding the requirements to the entire state, I will tell you the appetite is not there, and I do believe we need to look at what we have currently within the Chesapeake Bay area and look at the issues that we have. And when we look at this program, we say, all right, systems need to be either inspected or pumped in the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Area every 5 years. But when you look at that program, these localities that are required to track this, monitor, and enforce, you have jurisdiction-wide, and then you have those that are not jurisdiction-wide. So the jurisdiction-wide, it's required of everyone. But those that are not jurisdiction-wide Chesapeake Bay localities, they're only in those areas that are identified as in the preservation areas. So what happens to those folks that aren't monitored, aren't tracked? We have a number of failed systems in those areas. We have no idea they're there. No idea they're there. That is a problem. That is a big problem. And then when you look at the jurisdiction-wide localities, we need to look at the issue of enforcement. Who enforces? It's up to the localities. Commonwealth's attorney. So when grandma has a failed system, who's responsible for going after grandma to get it fixed? Commonwealth's attorney, taking it to court, going through the judge. And I'm telling you folks, the appetite is not there for the Commonwealth's attorneys to do this, and it's not happening. So here we have all of these failed systems across the Commonwealth. And in order to fix this and to change this, I do believe we have to look at it differently. We're looking at it mainly, and we talk about the Chesapeake Bay area, but we need to look at it as a public health crisis, because that's exactly what it is. And it is a public health crisis. With a failed system, the bacteria, the viruses, the contaminated waters, it is a serious threat to the health of Virginians. So how do we fix it? Well, let's put it in the hands of the public health experts the folks over at the Virginia Department of Health. I know there was some legislation in the past looking at doing this, and it got changed throughout the process, but I do believe getting it into the hands of the health department for the enforcement to occur, where the enforcement can happen, you will have better compliance, you will have a much better outcome in the long run and capture those folks that we're missing currently. I'm actually proposing legislation in the upcoming session that would allow a locality with a local option, possibly, we're still in talking through this, but to require the local health departments and require the local health departments to enforce, monitor, and with the inspection and lay the ground rules for the inspections of these systems within that locality. Now, when you look at this, what would the locality's role be? The locality can still be involved, still be the gatekeeper, still get the information to the health department. So it could be a good partnership. These are some of the things that we're actually talking about. But until we really start to look at it as a public health crisis and look at the issues that we currently have within the currently program, I think we need to look at that first. And this could possibly, what I'm proposing, could be a pilot program to be able to look at ways to fix it and possibly expand across the Commonwealth.
Delia Bulova.
Yeah, and if I could, I think septics, if you just looked at the order of magnitude of the problem across Virginia, it's a huge issue. And I think part of the problem, so when you are the owner of a septic system and you're in a rural area that doesn't have access to a wastewater treatment facility, I mean, your options are relatively limited. And so you either take your existing septic system and try to upgrade it, or you might do a package treatment system among a couple of different neighbors. But when you think about it, really the big difference between a wastewater treatment facility in an urban area versus those two options is that the wastewater treatment system, it's got economies of scale, right? And so you can make things more efficient. And you also share the risk. And so an individual homeowner doesn't have to worry about whether their system is going to fail, again, because they're paying into it and everybody takes a piece of that risk. I think part of our challenge in the General Assembly and for you all is to expand some of those options that we're looking at. And so I know Fairfax County in our big area that has concentration of septic systems, so it's the Occoquan downzoned area, they were actually looking at putting together something like an authority that would help to cooperatively or collectively manage septic systems. And so again, realizing it would be a little different than a traditional authority and that everything doesn't flow to the same place, you still would have a larger authority that would be able to manage those systems. They would be able to ensure that there's consistent operation and maintenance. They'd be able to enjoy those economies of scale. So anyways, I think it's those kind of things that we need to make sure that the enabling authority is in the code to allow localities to think outside the box and come up with some creative management solutions to help some of these localities.
That also reinforces Keith's earlier point about changing with the times. I guess you can look back and see why the Commonwealth Attorney could prosecute someone for not building a proper septic system, but now we have a real problem. So to have the mechanism be the Commonwealth Attorney and not the Department of Health just makes no sense. I mean, another place we have that is the opioid epidemic. We feel like that we know it's at historic proportions, but we're not fully, we can't fully account for people that are having opioid overdoses because you know where you report it? To the state police. So the people immediately think, oh, we're going to go after them and arrest them and prosecute them. No, we're just trying to get our arms around the problem. So maybe the Department of Health is an example there, but that's an adjustment that needs to be made.
Okay. Anyone else on septic? All right. Delegate Stolley, let's talk roads. How do you see the legislature assisting the state government agencies and localities in revising their construction or reconstruction design standards or funding that so our transportation system can reflect predicted sea level rise and be more resilient?
Well, first, let me start off by thanking you. I really, really enjoy this conference, and one of the things that I enjoy most We get a lot of presentations, and those presentations come up and they define problems. This proposes solutions, and then gets those solutions up front so that we can start to talk about them. So I really want to commend you for that. I think it's really important that we not just talk about the problems, but how we're actually going to take and solve some of these problems. Also, I want to commit or thank everyone in this room, because by being here, you all are leaders in what we're trying to do. We don't move forward without your commitment and your engagement. And just looking at this room, you need a bigger room next year. Looking at this room and filling it up year after year, it just speaks that commitment. Virginia is getting the reputation as the state that is forward-looking. We're trying to solve the problem before it's a crisis. And we know that other states have taken and solved this problem, and they've solved this problem after they've had a crisis and after they've had a loss of life due to storms or their economies damaged moving forward. We're looking at doing that before the crisis occurs. And to me, that speaks volumes of the efforts, and just the movement that we've seen over the last 5 years is truly incredible. So now I'll talk about roads.
Terrific.
I want to start with smart scale, because I think there's a lot of confusion. Paul brought up the fact, is there something that the state has to take into consideration as far as flooding and weather with smart scale? And the answer is yes. Smart scale has to take weather and flooding into account whenever it's doing constructions. It's part of the prioritization. I carried the smart scale bill that put this into place. Prior to smart scale, road construction decisions were made by politicians fighting between themselves on how we're going to build roads. Smart scale assigns specific criteria based on engineering information on how we're going to prioritize these roads and build these roads, flooding, weather events, whether it's storm, nor'easter, or a snowstorm, all factors into whether a road gets built or not. Smart scale is for new construction. There's a totally separate pot of money that deals with maintenance of roads. So if you're talking about updating a road or fixing a road or better building a road, that comes out of a different pot of money than smart scale. Smart scale is broken up itself into two pots. One is a statewide pot of money where the CTB allocates to roads. The second one is a regional. So each region gets a pot of money, and they get to set their own smart scale criteria on how they build the roads. Problem with smart scale, again, it applies primarily to roads and interstate highways that the state is building. Of the 60,000 miles of road, those only constitute about 10,000 miles. So the other 50,000 miles either falls to cities and to a couple counties to take and maintain those roads, or the state maintains the roads outside the cities and counties. So I think that to say that this is a smart scale issue isn't correct. This is a maintenance of road issue, and how do we move forward with those maintenance of roads? Most of that is going to fall to localities, because localities are the ones that get to make those decisions on what is done for the maintenance of those roads and how those roads are going to be built moving forward. Additionally, there is a secondary street acceptance program, and this sets criteria for those roads that the state is going to maintain. If we want to impact local decisions, that's where we need to do it. It was updated in 2009, I think 2011. We looked at that area to say, these are how we set criteria for roads that the state is going to accept in.
Thank you for clarifying that, because maintenance funds, that is a big issue, and I'm very glad you raised that. Did anyone else want to add to that about roads?
Chris is right, smart scale was great at taking it out of the person with the most power deciding where you build the road. But it's also some challenging when you talk about the maintenance side. With the third phase of 64, it's going right through Queens Lake. When we built the interstate, Queens Lake's a neighborhood just off the interstate, when we built it right through there 50 years ago, they did it with all the technology that they had at the time, but there's a pipe this big and a culvert that David and I could put our arms down, that the runoff goes straight down, and it hit a concrete barrier to take Well, if you think of what it's done to the streams back there, and now it is cracked, the whole side is concave, and the water comes out of the middle somewhere. So to go and try to fix, now they did it the way they knew best 50 years ago, but we know a lot better now. But to go and try to do some stream mitigation and restoration from the damage previously done is outside the scope of smart scale. So VDOT's been very good to work with, but we had to go find $350,000, $400,000 additional dollars to rectify the damage that's been done over the years. So you have to, and maybe that speaks to the maintenance side of it as well.
Well, and I think that speaks to the problem that these are problems that are tied together, but they have to be funded separately. If you start to try and tie in all these ancillary issues that areas have had associated with transportation to a transportation project, you would never build a transportation project.
And Delegate Bulova, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything from urbanized Northern Virginia's perspective.
Do you have a problem there?
Well, we do have a problem up there. It's slightly different in that, we're not talking about inundation, directly from the bay or from an estuary, but, with respect to climate change and the flashiness of the storms that we're seeing. And so, again, we, in the city of Fairfax, undertook a relatively major capital infrastructure project using our regional funds because with, the increased storm frequency and duration, our stormwater management system was no longer able to handle the volume of the stormwater, and that routinely flooded a very, very major interchange. And so, I think while it's a different kind of issue that you're experiencing, ultimately the impact on residents, businesses, and the economy are the same. And so there's the same kind of funding needs that we're going to need to be considerate of.
So Delegate Hodges, let's talk about septic again.
Uh-oh.
So what are the pros and cons of legislatively requiring people to connect to municipal sewer systems versus using individual septic systems or community package plants? Do you prefer one approach over the other, perhaps with some constraints?
Well, I will tell you, I am typically not a fan of mandatory hookups. And have run into issues where it's just not cost effective for the homeowner to do it. Actually, one instance, the individual received a building permit from the locality, was under construction, had a well and septic permit in a traditional on-site system. Then the locality comes in and says, you need to hook up to both systems, bore under the road, and the increased cost to the individual was almost $40,000, and they had already started construction. They eventually walked away from building the home, and it's now growing up, and the foundation and the footing are sitting there, and it's been sitting there for probably 7 or 8 years. So I'll look at this, but then again, we want to look at it and get folks onto the municipal systems because it is much better for water quality in the long run, but how do we get there? One of the issues that we're dealing with, of course, is the failed system, but the alternative systems, especially with recurrent flooding. These systems cannot handle the increased salt water and weren't designed to be under the conditions that they're placed under now. And these alternative systems that were put into place, they were great, when we thought about them years ago because folks could build on their land where they couldn't build before. But they're expensive. And like any other, they have a life of, give or take, 20 years or so? So in looking at this with maintenance and costs, this is really probably the single largest expenditure that an individual would have on any of these homes. Averaging over that 20 years about $300 a month, possibly. It's a large expense, and then 20 years later, you've got to do it again, and guess what? Folks don't have that money to build that system. So these systems are failing and creating a problem. And you look at the inventory and the thousands of these systems that have been built over the years. Think about that inventory for a moment. Hundreds of millions of dollars. Just in my district, hundreds of millions of dollars in a very rural region. Now, if you take those dollars and look at that And if we had thought about it 30, 40 years ago, whenever we really started to look at these systems, if we thought about that, how could we have done things differently to expand and do things differently, as Delegate Bulova said? We need to have a much larger, holistic approach with funding. How we get there, I have no idea. These are some of the things I've just really started to think about and talking to other folks about, but it's a community-wide problem. And we're focusing on individual homes. We need to look at it on a much larger scale and come together and find a way to fix this. I don't know the answer, but we're gonna really start to dig into this and have some creative options, hopefully, in the future.
And even if you do require mandatory connection to the sewer system, it's still a funding issue, isn't it?
It's still a funding
Because
issue.
a low-income household still has
Right.
to afford the monthly
Right.
fee, and the municipal system has to be able to adequately handle the
Correct.
additional
Correct.
capacity.
Correct.
So, did anyone else want to comment on that?
I can jump in on kind of the funding part, and I guess, you know, we got a lot of options to choose from the presentation. There's a number of states that are being creative about how they attack this, and so whether we're talking about low-interest loans, or whether we're talking about grants, or whether we're talking about mandatory hookup, or, you know, whether we're talking about upgrading, you know, local systems, I think there's a plethora of things that are out there. I do think that we need to be cautious about grants, you know, again, because there's that fine line between you know, a public good and providing a gift to a private property owner. And so we need to make sure that there's always a very well-articulated public purpose to all this. I think one of the things that Keith touched on that's critically important, especially when we think about those funding options, is the order of magnitude of what we're dealing with. Right. And you know, we've got a good sense of, or an estimate of the scope of the problem. What we don't have is a really good sense of how much is that going to cost. And so kind of getting back to that whole thing, which is we don't want to mismatch you know, how we're going to fund this with the actual need, because then you set up expectations and ultimately we fail. And so we need to make sure that we're going in eyes wide open on some of that stuff. I think we do have a lot of really good existing Virginia programs, and so I think we need to make sure we're going back through there and ensuring that those work well together, and that localities and individuals know that they're out there and can be utilized. You know, I think the idea of kind of a grant ombudsman, I think that was mentioned earlier, is a really good one, so that you've got a gatekeeper that can help people do that. Chesapeake Bay restoration is a really, really good opportunity. And so one of the things about the Chesapeake Bay restoration is that any time that you disconnect a sanitary or a septic system and attach it to sewer system, we actually get credit under the Bay model for that. And so, you know, again, when you're looking at cost models and how we do this, we need to take into consideration that, boy, for every one of those septic systems that we take offline, that locality or Virginia gets to take credit for that, and so you get the double benefit. But the last one, and this is, I think, the tougher one, again, it gets to my earlier remarks, is, you know, how do we deal with the ongoing operation and maintenance? Because, again, you could invest in a new system, but ultimately it comes down to being able to afford to maintain that system in perpetuity. And, you know, here gets at the fact that you've got poor people in rural areas, and you've got poor people in urban areas. And so in the same way that you have people who are going to have a hard time operating and maintaining their septic system in Gloucester County or elsewhere, you've got people in Alexandria and Richmond, you know, who are barely able to afford their fees as well. So all that needs to be played into the mix. But I think we got some really good options out there, and, you know, it's a matter of, you know, figuring out what's the order of magnitude we're talking about, and then backtracking, you know, how are we really going to tackle this thing.
Well, it seems concerning to me that while we may have a good feel from a macro level what kind of problem we have, I'm not sure we know on a micro level, you know, what, you know, is yours failing, or what level is yours, or how, you know, so how we even get our arms around who's got a problem and where, you know, to begin to start trying to fix it, I think is pretty concerning as well.
And in our rural areas, having a municipal system or building those, is it cost effective? Right. I mean, you look at my district, very rural, but yet we're also the closest ones to the bay. We're at ground zero with the flooding. in these septic issues, the alternative systems that we have out there. And number one, identifying the problem, and then number two, the cost to fix that. Just dealing with the flooding and the issues that we have, and we have examples in our district where folks have just walked away from their properties because they're dealing with these flooding issues, recurrent flooding. And now they're gonna be dealing with these septic issues. So a number of these folks are starting to walk away from their properties. You know what that does to the tax base? We're already suffering in my district. We have no tax base. The folks that drive out of the district each and every day is 74% greater than anywhere in the state. And the folks that stay behind, we have the lowest wages in the state. And then you're looking at those folks, they don't have the dollars to afford to fix these systems. So in order to get there, we have to look at things in a totally different way. In order for it to work, in the end, we need to get folks incentivized to do something different.
So we started out talking about funding, and once again, we're talking about funding, and I think that Delegate Stolley would agree that roads, it's a similar issue. We need to do the same thing and assess what are the problems and how do we find the funding to fix them. That assessment needs to happen as well. One thing in talking about, just so we don't end with money too, in talking about natural and nature-based features, one of the issues is how do we increase public support for using those? Because it seems like one of the walls we run into is people may not be as familiar with, for example, the use of a living shoreline as they are with using a bulkhead, which has been used for years and years, or riprap revetment. So I don't know, do any of you have any suggestions for increasing public support of the use of NMBFs? Is there anything the legislature can do to assist with that?
Well, I thought some of the research that I've seen coming out of here was good to me, because I remember y'all showing me the economic benefits of natural barriers, natural-based systems. And at first it was very nonsensical to me. I don't, why would that be a benefit? But then you start showing the different properties that it impacted and helped. I think that's a good start. I was looking at Norfolk's plan, obviously they have to have they have a huge stake in this game, and their first bullet for residents. What can residents do? It's more living shorelines, that's the first thing they say, but 2 pages later, they balance that with the want and the need to develop and to live on the water. Chris and I are working on an aquaculture subcommittee right now that's the balance between the industry that's moving and booming and doing very well and people's property rights and their ability to enjoy the shoreline. So I think it's just more education and more awareness to how it is economically beneficial to us to have the areas like that. But that's a tough sell, because you have to get pretty deep into the work that y'all do, or make sure that somebody has a very deep understanding and awareness of the work you do before you can even get to that point. So.
And I couldn't agree more with Monty with respect to the focus on public education and outreach. And a lot of times it's just a matter of helping people to visualize what is the end product going to look like, and then also to think through what happens if you don't move forward with an approach, particularly with living shorelines. And we have had a very similar experience in Northern Virginia with urban stream restoration. And so urban stream restoration can be a very, very beneficial way of reducing phosphorus and nitrogen and sediment going into the Chesapeake Bay. But oftentimes it means going in there, and initially it's an engineering exercise. And so you're going to have to go through people's backyards. You're going to have to take down some trees. And people think about that short-term impact. They think about all sorts of things. Oh my gosh, if that stream is restored, we're going to have more snakes, and we're going to have all sorts of wild creatures running through my backyard. And so in all of those, it really came down to a concerted public education and outreach effort, whether you're talking about the state, whether you're talking the locality, whether you're talking about soil and water conservation districts, and really taking the messages out into the community and helping that community understand what it is that we're doing, why is it that we're doing it, and why does this make it more sustainable in the long term.
If I may, being a Dillon Rule state, we give our localities the General Assembly grants localities the ability to do certain things. When we pass laws in the General Assembly and give the localities they're asking for these things, we need to find a way to get them to act upon the things that we actually do. A few years ago, I passed legislation that, gosh, I'm trying to remember what it was, for living shorelines and tax exemption for the living shorelines through a local ordinance with the locality. I'm still not aware of a locality that's actually passed that ordinance. We also hear that we have failed septic systems and a problem with heirs property, where Cousin Sally lives in the property, but there are 12 owners in the family that actually are involved. The system fails, and it doesn't get fixed. But somehow, the taxes still get paid, and Cousin Sally lives there. It was actually a fairly simple bill that allowed a locality through ordinance to establish a low-interest loan program where it could be paid either through a water bill or a tax bill, and that actually loan could then be sold to the private sector. Still have not seen a locality that has actually passed that ordinance. So, we need to provide the tools to the localities, but we also need to work with them to take advantage of some of the tools that we provide.
Anyone else?
I would just jump on that. I think that there's a lot, and we see it here even in the questions. It's what is the General Assembly going to do? I think in a lot of these areas, the localities have the authority and the responsibility to take and address some of these issues. Many of these issues are very, very uncomfortable to meet face-to-face with constituents and say, oh, by the way, your septic system isn't working and we need to fix it. Your house is cut off and we can't get public safety vehicles down to you. So you have, again and again, these issues that are very, very local issues. It's very comfortable to say, well, the General Assembly passed a law and I have to do this. But these really need to be local decisions. And if we want to engage people in natural shorelines, if we want to engage people in raising the awareness of how important these issues are, we need to engage them at the local level, and the local governments have to be engaged in that. And it can't be that the General Assembly is directing how we're going to do statewide laws and force people to do things. This has to be engaged with the individuals locally, and they have to buy into these solutions.
Well, thank you all very much for this wonderful presentation, and I'd like to open up the floor for any questions you might have. We have students with microphones in the back. I see a hand back there.
Before I ask the question of Dr. Hodges, I want to preface it by declaring that the question is generated from a paper by Mr. Chris Santone, who appeared in the William & Mary Law School VCPC website this last summer, titled the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act, Proposed Modification to Improve Resiliency to Sea Level Rise. His idea of rolling RPAs captured my imagination as a creative resiliency strategy that could alter behavior by incentivizing less development in the areas that become part of RPAs. Delegate Hodges, in the 2018 session of the Virginia Assembly, you introduced Bill 1094. My first question is, do you intend to reintroduce the bill in the next session? And question number two is, if you do, would you consider adding the concept of rolling RPAs to your new bill?
Well, that's something moving forward with rolling RPAs is something to talk about moving forward. Actually, the legislation ended up as a study with VIMS to really look at being able to, and we call it the soggy sock bill. Let me back up just for a moment. Growing up in that area, when you ran around in your socks were dry. Now when you look and you run around, your socks are wet. And in many cases, we're looking at ways for folks to be able to protect their land from recurrent flooding. But if you read the legislation, it also was to promote water quality and living shorelines as well. So, and I think a lot of folks lost focus of that part. And just recently, I just met with the folks down at VIMS and reviewed a draft. And I do believe the final report was sent to the chairman just this week. And this actually can be done in a way that still provides for water quality and still can, promote wetlands. And if you look at when we look at this study that will be coming out, when you look at it, there's actually a 10% slope that an individual can use, at least within, our area and looking at our area, but a 10% slope that will still provides for the migration of wetlands with sea level rise. But then you also have to back it down, and you also have to look at water quality. And then you're looking at, all right, water quality is affected when you hit that 5% slope. But when you hit that 5% slope, things can be done with stormwater and additional features so that water quality is not affected. So this actually is coming out in this report. It was just sent to the chairman within the last, I believe, day or two. But I do plan to really take a hard look at the legislation and try to find some ways. This is not going to work in every case, and for the most part, it's going to work best not in the urban areas but in the rural areas. So if it is introduced again, we would probably look at it only in the rural coastal region, where I believe it can, the folks, instead of just raising their houses a few inches of dirt and doing it properly, can make a big difference in protecting their land and still promote water quality and the migration of the marshes, if that makes sense. It gets a little complicated. I sell drugs for a living, so somehow I've become the go-to person on some septic and water and groundwater, and so it's, but I look at it as problem solving.
Well, I'm glad to hear
We
you say.
must be able to look at things in a totally different way to solve these problems. And unless we do that, we're going to have, and start to respond in a different way, we're going to have some significant problems in the future.
I'm glad you said the rural areas and qualified it, because I'm from James City County, and when I look at the Chickahominy and the sea level rise and the impact that we see on the Wright, Yarmouth, and Gordon over time, and the terrain has much steeper slopes, as you're well aware of, that type of an approach wouldn't work, which is why the question on rolling RPAs.
Correct.
So, but here's where we need your help. I mean, y'all all professionals do this every day. Can you imagine explaining that to 136 other people that don't have your background? I mean, you lost half of them with soggy socks. So it is very complex information that they've become experts on through years of hard work and through the help of VIMS and through the Coastal Policy Law Clinic. But it is a very hard thing to boil that down in front of a committee of 20-some-odd people and explain to them the importance of what you're talking about.
In 3 minutes.
Exactly right, in 3 minutes. Being in the Rural Caucus and vice chair of the Rural Caucus, I have found just in that caucus, we are totally unique, we're totally different as a rural area than the rest of the state. And to sell your story is very, very difficult. Not only to sell to the urban folks, but just to other rural legislators.
Well, and if I could add, so in addition to what Keith was saying, I think it highlights the need for additional resources for technical assistance, both for localities and individual property owners. And so I know we've got a lot of great technical resources in Virginia, nowhere near enough if we're going to embark on some of these things. And so I think, as Keith knows, again, some of these things can be very complicated. And so you want to make sure that you're protecting water quality and you're protecting aquatic habitat. And so it doesn't mean that you can unleash property owners to go ahead and do these things. You need to make sure that you have the technical resources in place in order to make sure that any strategy succeeds. And so whether it's what you're talking about here or just larger coastal resiliency, we need to make that investment, because localities, it's, number one, it's inefficient, but they got other things that they got to do day to day, and so they're going to need some support when it comes to that technical aspect.
And if I could just jump on what Monty said as well, I was an engineer, I became a physician. I'm all about numbers and logic and going up, and here are the numbers, here's why we need to do this, here's the study that proves what we say. That means nothing in the General Assembly, okay? You need to go up with a really good story. You need to tell the story in a way that folks who have no idea what you're talking about understand what you're trying to say. We had some great presentations here, but if we tried to get that information into a summary for a legislator, it's not going to happen. You have to have the story of the why we need to do these things.
Excellent point. Anyone else have a question? Last one.
Speaker Pollard again. Thanks, great presentation. One thing I just wanted to add about the roadside, road issues in particular is the ditches, question of ditch maintenance. So when we think about road maintenance, it's not just the paved road, it's the ditch maintenance, and it's causing, we know in a lot of areas, the lack of maintenance of some of these ditches is creating some huge problems for flooding and exacerbating the problem. And so when you think about funding, opportunities to maybe specialize or focus some of that funding into that ditch maintenance effort will go a long way to help address some of those key issues. And so from a policy standpoint, how to incentivize that ditch maintenance piece itself, I think will help a lot. The other thing I just want to mention, that was just touch on something that was said, was the notion of bringing this expertise in this room. You also have a lot of private sector expertise in this area that could be brought to bear to help landowners and businesses who are waterfront operators to deal with this issue, and how to encourage that special business enterprise as a really kind of an opportunity out of the resiliency effort, and promote that kind of unique niche business opportunity and kind of economic development angle to that. There's been a lot of talk about that already, and I think we could do some more on that. And that could be kind of localized too, where the need is. These businesses can operate out of that area where the need exists, so that helps the local economy.
Well, please join me in thanking
Can I
our
make
panel.
one comment?
Oh,
If you
yeah.
don't mind on the ditches?
Yeah, oh.
Hate to bring that up. I mean, we hear a lot about ditches in my district. The number one issue. One of the things with the ditches that we don't often talk about or hear about is the outfall ditches, which are on private property. So folks call me all of the time, they need to pull this ditch, they need to fix this ditch. Well, the ditches, some of them in Matthews are 6 feet deep, if not deeper. But the water has nowhere to go because these outfall ditches that were built sometimes hundreds of years ago, we're dealing with colonial infrastructure in modern highways. And when those ditches were built, they were oftentimes built by farmers to manage that land and individuals. And as those ditches aren't managed, of course, they fill up. The water on the roads has nowhere to go. And VDOT, without an easement, can't go on that property. They won't touch that property. That creates a tremendous problem, especially with recurrent flooding, where when the high tide comes in our areas, guess where it goes? It goes right into the ditches, and it comes onto the side of the road. So we're dealing with a huge problem here, and we're being creative in some of our localities to start to look at certain trouble spots and doing some things a little bit different with our localities. But that is a problem that we're having a very hard time to get our arms around and to fix.
And how many legislators do you think, if you mention roads, say ditch maintenance? It's just not top of mind to most people, I would think.
So rather than dig into the ditch issue any further, please join me in thanking our panel.